Right. Awesome.
If you'd
Hey,
like to
everybody. Hey,
share
everybody.
screen sharing access, I can
Oh,
present.
yeah. Let me go ahead and do that. Thanks for joining us, everybody. All right, Matt, you're good to go. All right. It's going to. All right. Awesome. Thanks for joining us today, everybody. My name is Amber Center. I am a co-founder, chair of the board, and executive director of Supernova Women. And today we are going to be talking to you all about our social equity impact report, where we're going to share some findings with you on the return on investment for social equity programs. So really excited to share what we've been working on with you all. And we've been working on this for a few months. We've talked to stakeholders, regulators, legislators from around the country to gather all this data. And we've been working with Ecotone, who's here, who's going to be helping us present this. And yeah, really excited to share this information with you all. You can see there is a Q&A feature where you can ask questions. Please feel free to list your questions there. We're going to have a Q&A at the end, like the last 30 minutes or so. So we'll leave a good bit of time for Q&A. And then we've also got the chat feature. So I see some folks are already using it. What's good, Tahid? Glad to see everybody. A lot of familiar faces participating today. So wanted to talk a bit about Supernova. Next slide, please. So Supernova Women is a 501c3 nonprofit. We were founded in 2015 by Black and Brown women, and we work to empower Black and Brown people to become self-sufficient shareholders in the cannabis industry. And we do that through education, advocacy, and building networks. Next slide, please. So the board is made up of owners and operators in the space, all women of color. Myself, we've got our deputy director here, Caroline, Whitney Beatty, who's a vice president of the board. And then we've got Issa Marie Perez, Raven Duckett, Hope Wiseman, who are also directors, and our co-founder, who's actually not on this slide, and we have to go back and fix this slide, is Nina Parks. She's one of the co-founders as well as a director on the board of directors. So next slide, please. So why do we exist? Why do we do these things? Black ownership in cannabis is quite dismal, as we know, prior to legalization and prior to regulation in cannabis. There's a very good chance that most people were buying their cannabis from a Black or brown person. And now that the industry has been regulated, that the barriers are now incredibly high. And we've created these social equity programs to kind of address those very high barriers. Next slide. So we're an organization working to lower barriers of entry and building sustainability through impactful events, networking and networking to build inclusive supply chains. We advocate at the local, state, and national levels, advocating for policy change, which some of you in California, have you seen some of our actions here? We held one back in November at Oakland City Hall, and then we organized another effort at the California State Capitol just about 3 weeks ago, advocating for lower taxes and no taxes for equity businesses. We host a number of different educational events, and always making sure that we are producing things that are tangible to support and build sustainable businesses for Black and Brown people in cannabis. We created the first paid workforce development for social equity workers. Last year, we paid workers $20 an hour and also trained them on manufacturing as well as metric and compliance. And then, of course, direct distribution of grants to operators. We've issued $30,000 in grants to equity operators who've suffered losses during civil unrest and robberies and things of that nature. So our organization is constantly working to support Black and Brown business owners, as well as Black and Brown workers in cannabis, just trying to make sure that we're creating opportunities for Black and Brown people in cannabis. So next slide. And Caroline, would you like to say a few words, please?
Yes, thank you, Amber. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. It's exciting to see people from so many different places joining this webinar. Last year, when Supernova Women was trying to think of what we could do to really impact the social equity conversation, we came up with this idea of creating a report that was steeped in data. I think that we all know that the term social equity has been floating around for a few years and has been made up of ideas and ideals, some of which we've seen implemented and some of which we hope to see implemented. We know that something missing from the conversation has been information on how social equity programs can impact local economies. So we wanted to make sure that we were giving our fellow advocates a tool that they could take to legislative meetings with them so they could advocate for better policies in their communities. So I hope that's what we are presenting to you today. And I want to thank Ecotone for all of their work on this and my fellow board members, also all of the amazing folks that contributed in interviews to this analysis. And of course, I'd like to thank Weedmaps for their important support of our ability to conduct this analysis.
Excellent. Well, with that, I can share our presentation on our social equity analysis. Thank you so much, Amber and Carolyn, for sharing. We've been excited to work with the entire team of Supernova Women. And today we're going to share a little bit about what that report entails, some of the insights that came out of it. And then as you heard, please feel free to utilize the chat bar, the Q&A. We want to make sure that this is your time that we are sharing out. We are Ecotone Analytics. We're a public benefit corporation, certified B Corp, working with organizations that are looking to improve their impact through evidence-informed decision-making, really identifying what those key performance indicators are and supporting those organizations in achieving goals. So I want to start the conversation just by talking about why social impact analysis matters and this idea of social return on investment. Really what we've seen are organizations are looking for three things, both to make data-driven decisions internally through programs, through strategies, and then externally. This is something that we're seeing investors, donors, as there's more transparency in the marketplace, are demanding that evidence of impact. And so we're excited to be able to share this information with you today and to be able to move beyond simple output metrics, but to talk about those longer term impacts to community. This just highlights at a very high level what our engagement with Supernova Women team looked like. We engaged through milestone meetings, originally doing that data intake, talking about scoping, key issues, building out that logic model that we'll share with you today, and then focus on drafting that social return on investment. All this information is available with Supernova Women team. They'd be happy to share the technical documentation or any other information that we'll go over today as well. In terms of just providing a little bit of background on the methodology of how we come to do the work that we do, it's really about identifying what is that evidence of impact, and then taking from an applied economic standpoint, how can we monetize or gain an understanding of that monetized benefit? And then you're seeing divided by the overall organizational program costs to really be able to put a metric of social return on investment. We do this with all of the leading national global frameworks. And so we follow the impact management project, as well as making sure we are aligned with UN Sustainable Development Goals for all of our reporting. If there's any questions, like we said, we're happy to answer throughout the process. We've worked with a number of organizations ranging from a number of different issue areas, as you're seeing, from sustainable ag, education equity, workforce development, climate action, corporate social responsibility. And we've been excited to work with this team. With that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Stephanie, to talk more about this report.
Thanks, Matt. So as he said, our process occurs over a series of milestone meetings. The first few are really dedicated to understanding what is Supernova doing, what's happening in the cannabis industry, as well as what is happening in social equity programs. And then from there, we interviewed experts from Supernova's network and combined that with secondary research. This all informed us in creating this logic model, which we used as the roadmap for understanding how is impact being created. We start all the way on this left side. What are those inputs or all the ingredients needed for a social equity program, as well as then what activities are happening? And for this model we included capital, business support, workforce development, as well as real estate. Then from there, we have outputs. So what are those countable things coming from the different activity? So things like number of people licensed, dollar amount going through the programs, and then outcomes. And we spend a lot of time on this outcome side, really tracing the links from the activities into the longer term impact. And so short-term outcomes includes things like that increased access to business support, and then intermediate outcomes that increased entrepreneurship and ownership into longer-term outcomes like increased earnings and wealth. Next slide, please. We then identify key performance indicators. And these are those metrics to track to help measure and manage the impact being created. So scale KPIs include those growth opportunities, so number of equity operators served, and then quality KPIs, so how to improve the program, things to track like the ratio of social equity operators permitted or licensed and operating compared to general equity operators. Next slide, please, Matt. We also identify the impact management project's 5 dimensions of impact. This is out of the impact management project, which is an organization working globally to build consensus on how to measure and report on impact. The 5 dimensions of impact is a framework they have for communicating what all is happening in a program, who is being served, how much, so things like how long, how many people are served, or how much money is going through the program. And then contribution being, how do we know that it is creating impact? And risk mitigation being, what is the risk of impact not being generated? But things like the increased surveying and data collection that's happening in cannabis social equity programs has been really promising and has definitely helped reduce that evidence risk. Next slide, please, Matt. So our analysis then culminates in this social return on investment projection. And so for every dollar spent on this potential program, $1.20 in social value is generated through increased earnings, increased wealth, increased health, and increased tax revenue. This is based on an average cost per equity operator of $37,000. And again, this is based on those 4 program features: capital, real estate, business support services, and workforce development. And it's all the different line items. So things like administration, what does it take to run a workforce development program? And this is based both on conversation with Supernova as well as external research on social equity programs we've seen across the US. As well as then we project those benefits per equity operator. And this is $44,575 based on 7 monetized outcomes, the largest of which being increased tax revenue from additional equity operator businesses, followed then by increased asset building from business ownership. And next slide, Matt. This next slide then shares that same information. So for every $1 invested in this potential program, there's a projected $1.20 in social return. And these benefits are projected over 5 years, which is in alignment with external research, a lot of which is coming out of workforce development and entrepreneur support programs. So starting on this left-hand side, you see that average cost per equity operator. And then it grows and you see all the different outcomes that come from the program, then the impacts that are associated with each of those outcomes into who benefits. So if you follow that top one, the increased tax revenue from additional equity operator cannabis businesses, then we had modeled that based on 100% of tax revenue going to community reinvestment. And you can trace where that money is going. So tax funds, as well as then community members in disproportionately impacted areas. Next slide, Matt. And so through this analysis, we have a few insights, including support for equity operators leads to additional community reinvestment, and that reinvestment has net positive impacts. It's really important to consider also how that money is getting directed. And so in that visualized slide on the previous page, we didn't make any assumptions about how that money was being spent. But when we consider how it is being spent, which based on what we saw in jurisdictions across the US, it varied quite a bit. But we modeled it going to early childhood education, health, and expungement assistance programs. And when we do that, we see that social return on investment can pretty quickly jump up. So in that model, we saw for every $1 invested, it goes to $4.56 in social return. We also see that for every equity applicant becoming a business owner, they can increase their wealth a projected $50,000 over 5 years. Next slide, Matt. And so through this, we also heard quite a bit through our interviews as well as in research that time to revenue generation can be a huge barrier, just limiting in general who can participate to begin with, as well as then impacting the likelihood of success, because the longer it takes owners to operate, of course, is a lot more time before they can start earning money and generating that revenue. Additionally, we see that community providing workforce development opportunities and entrepreneurship pathways is quite a large value driver in the analysis. And so that the more people that can be learning skills and different things within the industry and converting that into ownership pathways, if they want, can just bump up that SROI based on those who can increase that wealth generation. We also see that surveying of equity operators and program stakeholders would be really beneficial based on what current programs are doing, what's helpful, what's successful, what services have been most utilized. Definitely would continue to aid in analysis, as well as then connecting individuals with shared experience and goals, kind of related to that continued surveying, really helpful for understanding what has worked and how can more people continue to learn and grow together. Next slide, Matt. And so we also identify a few opportunities to increase that SROI. And while it's not always the goal of every initiative, we identify a few opportunities here. The first being increasing the value of the business. So that is that primary driver of wealth creation for operators. And so the more that that can be grown, the more that SROI would continue to grow as well. And again, increasing that value of community reinvestment or directing it to specific programs. So we saw that in community reinvestment, we did 100% going to of tax revenue going to community reinvestment. But when that changes, it pretty quickly goes below $1, the SRY does. And alternatively, though, when you start directing it towards different programs and how that money is going to be spent, that SRY can very quickly increase. And then further, leveraging private capital can help reduce public expenditure, which then would reduce the scale of public investment required to deliver the program. So on that left side of the visualization, the more you can leverage other capital sources can help lower that barrier. And we just want to thank Supernova for all their support, and the connection to experts and industry knowledge has been very helpful within this analysis.
And with that, I believe we'd be happy to open that up to questions.
Yeah, so if you do have questions, you can feel free to raise your hand in the using the raise your hand feature. We can also even, I believe, allow you to talk or promote you to a panelist. That way, if you want to be on video or you want to talk, so that we can hear your question. That way you don't have to type it all. You can do that also. And first question is, will the report and data be available live? Yes. You'll get an email with this presentation here, as well as an FAQ, so that you can better understand the data that was presented today. And we'll also make this recording available so that you can go back and listen to the recording again. All right, so Taid's got a question. Outside of the data given by operators, which stakeholders provided the best or most important kind of data needed for this report? We actually didn't get any data from operators. We got all of the data from the regulators in the jurisdictions that have social equity programs. So Massachusetts, Oakland, LA, and I'll let Ecotone speak a bit more to that, but this was not anecdotal data that came from operators. This actually came from the regulators.
Yeah, I would just echo that. We pulled information from a variety of sources, a lot of it being from California and Massachusetts. The information kind of varied based on what program had what service feature that we were including. That being said, we take that information, so stuff like how many people were served, and we pull that through and link it to secondary research. So a lot of it was as tailored to social equity programs as possible, but certainly a space to continue to grow in what data is publicly available.
Another question was, what platform will the recording be available on? The recordings, I think, are like MP4 files. So they're QuickTime files if you've got a Mac or like video player. So they'll be able to be viewed on a number of different platforms, but it is an MP4 file. Okay, Bram's got a question. Hello, Bram. Could you give more detail on the dollar and $1.20? What investment? What is the return? I'll let Stephanie and Matt speak to this a bit more.
So that $1 to $1.20 is a ratio based on, like Matt has pulled up, that estimated return on investment. So 44,575 divided by that average cost per equity operator. And so again, that cost per equity operator was based on what we were able to see for what it takes to run a workforce development program or business support service, and just doing that ratio.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. All right, we've got a question from Anna Ray. Can you clarify what the source of money was that the dollar analysis came from? Meaning, was it grants, state money, local money, to whom, etc.?
Yeah, definitely. So we don't make any assumption around who is paying for that initial average cost per equity operator, but some of the cost types included in that $37,000 figure are like the legal, financial services, how much does that cost? What is program administration? So permitting, what is the estimated amount per equity operator? So staff time, as well as then real estate space, what would it take to manage that? And workforce development, how much is required to run a program like that. And all of those are different line items that we include in the technical document.
Thank you. How will you use this information going forward? And how can interested and invested members of the community help to illuminate and uplift the work that we're doing? Great question. So we're going to use this in a number of ways. We're going to use this to advocate for equity programs in places that do not have equity programs, to show what the actual return, potential return on investment is for an ideal equity program. So that's one way that our community members can use this information as well. And we'll also be using it to advocate for cannabis tax reform. As you know, cannabis taxes here in California are incredibly high. They pose as a huge barrier to social equity operators. You can see here on this slide that's on the screen who is benefiting the most from the equity program, and it is the tax fund. So this is a very easy way to show our legislators that operators are using a lot of their money towards taxes, and that money should be reinvested back into the equity operators. So thank you. Next question. Thank you for your work. We all know the social equity programs aren't great. How will this info be used to push forward social equity in a more progressive way, in an open way? And how is this info helpful? I would say that this makes the case in those 4 buckets that we've been talking about here. Access to capital, access to real estate, access to technical support, and workforce development programs. When those 4 components are part of a social equity program, you'll see a return on investment within the community. So that is really how we can use this information to continue to push social equity programs forward and show that they're worth the investment for the community.
And I think another thing to add, in putting together this report, we wanted to make sure it was a tool for people. And I think we all know that there are messages that work in different settings. And for some legislators, thinking about the bottom line, thinking about how social equity programs can improve the economy, that's the message they want to hear. It's less about quality of life. It's less about reinvesting in the community per se. So hopefully this gives you an additional tool to use when you're going out and talking to folks on different sides of the aisle.
Yeah, thank you for that, Caroline. Okay, next question. Is the 5% floor for success of social equity programs? And if so, is there a percent sweet spot that gives us the most impact per dollar? Stephanie? Will?
Yeah, so we modeled that 5% based on what we were able to see from the average tax collected per cannabis business. And so we had to make some assumptions around first how much revenue different businesses were making. We, as much as possible, leverage survey data to understand where equity operators were operating from. And so we use that 5% just as the baseline for what we saw, but then we modeled different amounts of community reinvestment occurring. And so that 100% is really that optimal spot. Below that, it pretty quickly, the social return drops below $1. And even more importantly, the more that that money is being spent and directed to different programs. So again, that early childhood or expungement assistance opportunity, the more those things are happening, that SROI bumps up pretty quickly.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Okay, the next question. Is this report a one-time process, or will there be an ongoing report research tracking conducted as the industry continues to move across the country? We would love to continue to do this work. Of course, we have to make sure that this work is funded. That's why it's really important to support nonprofit organizations that are doing work, especially when it's based on data. We would love to continue to build on this report every year, and that's actually our plan. But of course, that's all contingent on making sure that that we have the funding to be able to do it. So thank you for that question. Taid, looks like I think we've answered your question, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that, reading what you wrote in the chat here. Thank you. Question for Amber or Caroline. A disproportionate return is going back to taxes. Agreed. Do you have a target return that you would like to see go back to communities and operators, as well as a future benchmark for success? I mean, ideally, in my in an ideal world, 100% of the cannabis tax revenues generated from cannabis tax sales would go back into the communities as well as equity programs. So, you know, that's ideally like what we shoot for, is 100%. Do we have a target number that's less than that? Not really. Whenever we're going and when I'm advocating for these programs, when we're talking to the city of Oakland, when we're talking to our legislators, you know, we're always striving for 100%. Like, of course, they tell us like we can't do that, but ideally, that is what would happen. I hope that answers your question. And Caroline, if you want to add to that, you're more than welcome to.
I think you answered that quite well, Amber. I think that we've always taken the approach to, you know, shoot for the moon on things like this, and hope that we get some of what we're asking for. And I don't think asking for all of it to be returned and reinvested is asking too much.
Agreed. Okay, next question is this report available online? We're going to email this report out to everyone at the end of the presentation here. And I think we'll make this PDF available for download on our website as well as the FAQ. So that will be up in the next 24 to 48 hours on our website. Next question here on the chat. Does 5% represent local cannabis tax? If so, many of us want to do away with it. In San Francisco, we have deferred it. It was never implemented. Stephanie, you want to talk about that?
Yep. So that 5% tax, we, as much as possible, tried to base this analysis on national information. But of course, the data varied quite a bit by different programs. And so as far as the tax rate and the average amount collected per business and that revenue generated or expected per equity operator, it was based on various places within California.
I also want to mention that none of the localities are funding these equity programs. The funding comes from the state. So the state has special funds and buckets of money set up to fund all the local programs. The only locality municipality that I'm aware of that funded a social equity program was Oakland in the very beginning. It was $3.4 million that they took from license fees and application fees during the first round of licensing back when legalization first happened in 2017, when they were collecting those fees back in 2017. So yeah, this is not really an issue of local taxes as much as it is at the state. And the next question from Dr. Angela. Hello, Dr. Angela. We're asking for less than what is owed to our communities stolen from our communities. Yes, so asking for 100% is justified. 100%. Agreed. Next question from Alicia Bird. Hey, Alicia. As an equity business, what can we do to help support the reduction of taxes? Really, I mean, Alicia, you're doing what we need. You show up at the events, you really heed the calls to action. We'll have a number of calls to action. Next, we're going to be working on lobbying and advocating to our legislators to reduce the taxes. We're asking for that right now, a reduction of taxes, but it's going to take 2/3 of the legislature in order to get that passed. That's a lot of people. That's a majority. And that means we're going to have to do a lot of work in order to convince these folks to reduce our taxes. Lots of phone calls, lots of emails, and lots of direct action like we did at the Capitol, petitions, things of that nature. So we're going to be quite active between now and July in advocating for elimination and reduction of certain cannabis taxes. Any other questions? I think Ecotone can speak a bit about their work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today. If you are interested in learning more, put my contact information up there. Happy to share more about the work that we do. And as we heard today, if you're interested specifically in learning more about the work of Supernova Women, please stay tuned to that subsequent contact information that will be sent out on all of this analysis.
Thank you, Matt. We had one other question come in. Is there a way that regular citizens can be involved? How can we get the general population included? It's really very much exactly what we've been saying as far as heeding the calls to our calls to action. If we ask you to call in and call your local legislator and ask and demand certain things, we always include a script on what to say. We'll include their email addresses so you can send them emails. And of course, you can, as a citizen, can say, hey, you can't afford this cannabis. Like it's so heavily taxed that you can't afford it. Maybe you're a patient, maybe you're just, well, really all people that consume cannabis are using it for medicinal use. So I don't even get into recreational or adult use versus medicinal use, but really, you know, like tell your own story. You know, cannabis is very expensive. It's expensive for everyone and very affordable for few. Like it's just not affordable. So yeah, just calling and telling your story and being true to your struggle, I think goes a long way and resonates very much with legislators. And any other questions? All right, well, thank you again, everyone, for attending our town hall today. I hope you found it useful. Really excited to continue doing this work. We are going to send out a link so that you can view this video, and we'll also include a PDF download of the presentation today, as well as an FAQ. If you want to dig a bit more into the technical documents, just shoot us a message. I'm Amber at supernovawomen.com, and definitely available to answer questions that you all may have. Really would also love feedback from everyone on how they use this tool to advocate in your communities for social equity programs, as well as cannabis tax reform. I know that's not something that the rest of the states are really talking about yet, and it's affecting Californians big time, but just know that eventually you all, especially in Illinois and Massachusetts, New York, are going to be asking for cannabis tax reform because your taxes are more than ours, and that's going to affect your businesses, and it's going to affect the patients. So yeah, just keep these tools as part of your kit. They'll come in handy, and yeah, we're just looking forward to continuing to support our community and provide you all with tangible things that then you can use to affect change. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much to Weed Maps and to Ecotone for helping make this report possible.
Thank you, Ecotone. Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks, Matt.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.